Welcome. Today, I'm really excited to talk to you about a new law that goes into effect January 1st, 2024. And you might want to tune out. You might think, oh my gosh, this has nothing to do with me, but I'm going to warn you. You are directly in the crosshairs of this law if you are listening and you have an LLC. And so I want to tell you what the new law is, what it's meant to do, and then what you actually need to do to make sure you get into compliance and stay in compliance. All right, let's go. So I want to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act. This is a brand new law. Basically, it's been years in the making, and honestly, it is a very positive development. It's a very good thing. It's essentially through FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is part of the U.S. Treasury. It's a very small agency inside the Treasury. And FinCEN has developed this law basically to combat money laundering, human trafficking, and financial crimes. All right. So it's a very good thing. And the reason that this law is so important is because in the United States, it is so incredibly easy to form a corporation. This is done at the state level, not at the federal level. And something that is very interesting here is that it's one of those cases where the most lax rules are the ones that win. You've probably heard of Delaware corporations, but there's actually far more than that. Like South Dakota has become a big one. There's a lot of the rules in the various states about what is required of you when you form an LLC are so minimal that they do not even require you to report who owns the LLC. As you can imagine, what this enables is the making of a shell corporation. It used to be that when you thought of a shell corporation, you would think of, an island in the Caribbean. But what's happening now is that the U.S. has actually taken the lead. The U.S. is now the leading jurisdiction for the incorporation of shell companies, beating the traditional tax havens like the British Virgin Islands or the Cayman Islands. So in other words, enough states in the United States have made the LLC formation requirements so lax that a lot of international bodies, a lot of organized crime units have begun to establish LLCs that are US-based, where essentially no one knows who owns the thing. And therefore, you can run crime through it, whether it's money laundering, human trafficking, you name your financial crime. And you can't really, it's very difficult to catch you. What it has taken to date is subpoenas, grand juries, like incredible amounts of law enforcement manpower in order to actually catch the people behind these crimes because of that incredibly low barrier to entry for forming an LLC in this country. So here comes FinCEN after years of work passing this new law called the Corporate Transparency Act, and it's a wonderful thing. And essentially what it means is now, starting January 1st, 2024, so as you're listening to this, that's only in a couple days, now anyone who has an LLC in the United States, the rule is a little more specific than that. Any entity that is registered with the Secretary of State must report any beneficial owner who has beneficial ownership in that entity more than 25% stake, okay? So if you are a single member LLC, this law is directly applicable to you, all right? So one thing I want to just mention here really quick is that I really love how easy it is to start a business in the US. That is a really positive thing for those of us doing good in the world, right? If you're a scrappy solopreneur out there who wants to just you have a great business idea and you want to just get it started, you can do that, right? The barriers are so low to entry. You can do it really easily. And that is a wonderful thing. It's something I'm constantly teaching about in my programs, how fantastic it is. Like day one, you can be a business up and running. However, there is this negative side to that, right? When we make it that easy, you can have, and you will get bad actors. right, who use those rules to their advantage. So in other words, the Corporate Transparency Act has been created and goes into effect January 1st, essentially to catch the criminals. All right. So really, I don't want you to freak out. This is not a thing that is really going to harm you so long as you're, not money laundering or, doing other awful shit. Okay. But you do need to make sure you take some action to become compliant with the law. So I want to go over what you need to do if you have an entity that was formed at the level of the Secretary of State. And just FYI, that's the technical definition of who has to comply with this law. In general, who that's going to mean is an LLC, because LLCs are established through your Secretary of State of the state, generally the state that you live in. Not obviously every time, there's this thing about Delaware corporations, et cetera. But in general, if you have an LLC, this law applies to you. Okay. Now, there are actually some people it may apply to in addition to that, including if your state rules make you go through a Secretary of State. For example, if you file a DBA, not all DBAs, doing business as, not all of those are going to go through the Secretary of State. But if in your state the rules say yours does, you should be aware of this rule as well. So actually, the circle is a little broader than simply people who have an LLC. It may be if you have done any registering of your business through your state's Secretary of State. Okay, it's a good time to check. All right. All right. So let me run through what this law says and what you need to do about it. Okay. All right. So technically, the law says that new and existing entities organized or registered with the Secretary of State. Now, when we say Secretary of State here, we mean your state's Secretary of State. So for me, that would be the Secretary of State of the state of North Carolina. For you, it might be Arizona, New York, Hawaii, whatever, right? New and existing entities organized or registered with the Secretary of State must report their beneficial owners of more than 25%. Now, what does that mean? Beneficial owner is some new terminology developed as a product of this law. In other words, what we're looking to do with this law is to identify who's behind the LLC. In other words, all that anonymity that you might have gained with the LLC, we're going to put all the names of the beneficial owners, the people who are behind these LLCs, we're going to put those into a database. I want you to know that this is not a public database, all right? So you don't need to be concerned about that, with an asterisk on those of you in New York. Just a second for that. But in general, if you're outside of New York, it is a non-public database, but it will be accessible to law enforcement, okay? Various agencies of law enforcement. This is expected to affect about 32 million different entities. And again, it's run by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, which is a division of the U.S. Treasury. All right. Now, New Yorkers, pay attention for a second. I want you to know that New York State actually passed its own version of this, right? So kind of riding along this wave. New York passed the LLC Transparency Act. Now, in New York, my understanding, and some of this guidance is still kind of coming down, so my understanding is that in New York, this is specific to LLCs, whereas the federal law is a little more broad than that. But in New York, effective in 2025, so 1 year later, the New York law comes into effect. And the one thing I want you to know about New York is effectively, you're going to have to, if you have an LLC, developed through the Secretary of State of New York, then you are going to have to do this filing, and the database is public. Okay, so that's a little warning for you right there. I do not know yet. The details about these filings have not come out yet. And yes, I know that they're coming up, the federal one, in just a couple weeks. This is what makes tax law so difficult, right? People like me, we have to study these things and keep very, very close tabs to see like, okay, do we know how to file yet? Do we know how to file yet? And the answer is right now, as of the date I'm recording, no, we don't know. So in New York, I will give you a little warning. I'm often advising people around, whether they might want to consider an LLC or not. And the thing that I always just say to people is LLCs are something that you can look up at the Secretary of State, at the state where the LLC was formed. This has always been true. And your address will be part of public record. I like to say this because a number of people that I work with have had restraining orders and, domestic abuse situations. And you do not, if you're in a situation like that, you do not want your address made public and searchable. And that is a really good time to consider a PO box, my friends. So if you are in New York, this may be a moment. I don't know yet what the filing will look like and if they're going to make those addresses public, but I will just give a little heads up to anyone in New York who does not want their address public. Keep on top of what the New York filing requires. Keep on top of whether that address is going to be public. It may be the time that you decide you're ready to get a PO box. All right, moving on. So here's some details about what you actually have to do, basically, if you have an LLC. I want you to also understand that the target of this law is not big corporations, right? This is not one of those like corporate laws that I often kind of ignore because it has very little application for a self-employed person. This law, the Corporate Transparency Act, is the opposite. The target of this law is entities with fewer than 20 employees. If you are listening to this right now, that is you. So you are squarely in the crosshairs of this. However, so long as you are not, committing financial crimes, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. Okay. All right. So there's not going to be a fee for this filing. There's two different groups that have to be concerned, or actually, I should say 4 in total. There's 4 different types of filings. I'm very sad to tell you that no data has been published yet about how to file. So we don't know that information yet. I'm giving you the latest, and the latest is I can't send you anywhere to get this filing done. It doesn't exist yet. Okay, so stay tuned. I will give you an update when that comes out. But these are the 4 types of filing. 1, existing entities. Okay, so if you already have an LLC, like me, I will raise my hand. I have an LLC. Existing entities like me, I will have to file within 1 year of the new date, January 1st, 2024. So that effectively means you're going to have 1 year. Sometime within the year 2024, you will need to do this filing and state who your beneficial owner or owners are. Okay, that's pretty easy. The real warning, and don't miss that, of course, the penalties are stiff. I'm about to get to that. The real issue is new LLCs. So if you're in the beginning stages, if you are considering filing, establishing an LLC, you have a far shorter window. So I want everyone to be aware of. If you do not currently have an LLC, but are thinking of forming one, new LLCs must file this FinCEN report about your beneficial ownership within 30 days of creation. Okay. In other words, this should be paired with the creation of the LLC itself. You should consider this part of the paperwork you do to form your LLC in the first place. Okay. So I hope that the lawyers out there are very on top of this law. I would assume that they are, but I don't really know. And I hope that they will tell you all this if you use a lawyer as you do your LLC filing. Hopefully LegalZoom will put a little memo on there for people who form an LLC that way. I do not know. I do not know what their plans are. But here I am. Accountants will be able to file this form for you. Presumably lawyers could too. Although generally when you ask a professional to do your filing for you, they're going to charge you money. Whereas if you do it directly yourself, it will be free. Okay. All right. The 2 other groups that do have to be concerned about this is when you have a change in beneficial owner. then you will need to file a new report. In other words, you just need to update who's the current owner of this LLC, owner or owners, right? So if you formed it initially as a partnership with two owners and then one of them wants to leave and you reform the LLC, and now there's only one owner, you're going to have to file a new report. Okay. So this is a tickle in your brain I want you to keep there, that when the owner of the LLC shifts, right? When you have an ownership change now, I'm wanting you to understand that you have some paperwork to file. Okay. Should be pretty simple and straightforward. I don't technically know because it's not available for me to look at yet. And then lastly, if you need to file a correction or an amendment, right? You realize you made a mistake, you stated something wrong, then you have a 30-day window as well to file an amended beneficial owner report. Okay. This is not an annual report. This is not something you're going to do every year like you do your annual LLC update and filing. This is just when there's a change in ownership. Okay. And again, the only reason there's no tax due, you don't owe any money. This is really just so that there is a database at the US Treasury so that they can prosecute financial crimes. All right. I actually think it's a very, very wonderful and positive development. Also, my hat's off to New York, because I don't know if you know this, but I'm a little bit fascinated by the scams of the wealthy. And one of the things that I started to realize was happening when I lived in New York City was that a lot of people globally, in countries especially with less stable governments or without rule of law, use New York real estate as basically a holding place for their money. So they will just buy apartments almost like it's currency, right? To hold and store value. When maybe your home country's currency is not stable or is at risk of being just taken by the government. Okay. Doing this kind of work sure makes me appreciate rule of law and the stability of living in the United States and the currency that we have and how stable it is. I don't know if that's a thing you ever think about, but man, I do. Anyway, so a lot of people use LLCs to purchase real estate. So it's actually an LLC that owns the asset of the real estate. And often you can shield the actual buyer, right? If you form an LLC in an anonymous way, form a shell corporation, you can hold property without identifying who the owner is. A lot of this has been a phenomenon amongst big international cities like New York and London. London notoriously has a lot of oligarchs buying up property there. And New York, I feel very proud to say, has passed this new law in part to stop that, in part to do something about that issue. So I just want to mention that this was something that I noticed was a big problem in New York City. And I think it's really cool that New York State has actually taken some really direct action against it. Anyway, that is a good segue to let you know that also, if you own real estate or if you have any friends who own real estate, a lot of times people who have a rental property will, for legal protection, which is wise, will own the property in the name of an LLC. I want you to know, if that is you, that LLC is subject to this law, okay? So if you are the beneficial owner of an LLC that has real estate holdings, you will need to file these reports as well. So any of your friends who are landlords or dealing in rental properties, any brokers, real estate brokers that you know, please share this show so that your real estate friends hear this as well, because I would hate for anyone to get caught up on the bad side of this law. Penalties. What happens if you don't file? What happens if you don't comply with this law? Well, the penalties will be $500 per day after you're non-compliant, up to $10,000, and up to 2 years in prison for willful non-compliance. So that's fairly stiff. You can go to jail for this. Recommend highly that you just go ahead and file that paperwork. It's a lot easier. All right. So just to summarize, my concern about this law is really based around people who maybe lack the funds or the business sophistication to have their own accountant or have their own lawyer who would naturally bring this up in the course of a regular meeting. So if you are a scrappy solopreneur, a freelancer, and you have an LLC, you might really not be aware that this law is a thing, okay? So that's why I wanted to get this episode out. It's for you, because I want you to know if you have a filing with the Secretary of State of your state, if mostly that means if you have an LLC, you are going to need to do this filing to make sure you're compliant and make sure that you do not face any of those stiff penalties or, God forbid, jail time. So I definitely hope that if you know a professional development organization that helps small businesses, maybe you share this episode with them, because I certainly want anybody who is small scale and scrappy to have access to this information. It's very, very important. And lastly, I just want to say that, there's something kind of funny about working in tax law. I have to stay up to date on these issues, and believe me, there will be a part 2 episode once I learn about the actual filing. So I hope to help you with that as well. But something I find really interesting is that when I study the tax law, I find I get really optimistic. I actually think, what I get to see is like that laws are actually being passed. I think if this law didn't affect people that I work with on a daily basis, I might never have noticed that it happened. And it's possible you never noticed that it happened. And I know a lot of us like to bemoan the problems in our country, but when you see the amount of work that civil servants in this country are doing behind the scenes to actually pass laws like this, and believe me, they faced resistance. So this is a victory. If you hate money laundering, human trafficking, all those horrible, horrible things that go on because of shell corporations, you should feel a little sense of pride about the U.S. Treasury, about the U.S. government, because in fact, this law, the Corporate Transparency Act, is really there to stop it. So I hope that makes you feel a little bit good, right? So you have a little bit of paperwork. Okay. Is that a small price to pay to stop, teenagers from getting trafficked? Like they just busted a prostitution ring in the Boston area I just learned about when I was home for Thanksgiving. So this stuff really happens, and I think it should stop. So go U.S. Treasury, go Biden administration. I feel really proud to be part of a country that, despite all the bad press, it's functional. All right. So pass this episode on to anybody. Please pass this episode on to anybody you know who needs to hear it, anyone who you think might have an LLC or be considering forming an LLC, because they definitely are going to need to get involved and do this filing. All right. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. Have a great day. See you on the next one. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, be sure to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. I'm so grateful for that. This video is for education and entertainment only. Nothing in this episode should be taken as individual tax or financial advice. You can find all the tools, books, and links I reference at sunlighttax.com/podcast.